Hi there, my name is Dusty Rhodes and you're welcome to Amplified, the Engineer's Journal podcast. Often engineering is focused on technical, logistical and production parts of a project. Today we're going to hear from a leading engineer who believes that the best outcomes are reached by focusing on the people.
The reason that construction goes wrong is that the expectation of the customer and the belief from the contractor of what they're providing start misaligned. So that scope misalignment, it never gets better.
Our guest today has almost 30 years of experience with one of Ireland's leading construction companies, where he's worked in business operations and HR before moving on to the C-suite.
The time you spend thinking most about safety is normally immediately after an accident.
It's a pleasure to welcome BAM UK and Ireland's Executive Director of Ireland, Alasdair Henderson. Alasdair, how are you?
I'm fine, Dusty. Good to meet you.
Now, listen, I always get wild and varied answers to this first question. How did you get into this wonderful game of engineering? What was the little thing when you were a kid that went, whoa, I want to do that?
Well, I had a head start, Dusty. So my father was a civil engineer, still is a civil engineer, retired, but it's a lifestyle choice. It's not something you give up. So as I'm one of four boys, as we went around on various holidays with the family, we were perpetually standing up beside various structures for Dad to take photographs. We thought he was photographing us. He was there. He had us there for scale. So it becomes a sort of becomes a way of life. And so I've got a very vivid memory of when I was about 5 years old, going to one of the projects that Dad was working on. It was a tunnel project in Aberdeen. Of course, 5 years old, I had a hard hat that didn't fit me, and we went down a shaft in a rickety old cage, sharing the cage with a box of nitroglycerine explosives, and then went out along the tunnel. And when you're 5 years old, boy, does that make an impression on you. So I think I won't say it was predestined, but it was pretty well set up. So that's how I got into it.
So you just kind of went through secondary school and then on into university and everything. And when you came out then as a new graduate, you pretty much joined BAM straight away, and you've stayed there your whole career. What kept you there?
Well, we do fantastic, interesting things, and I've moved around in the business doing a lot of different things. So when I actually joined as a student. I did 2 years summer work as a student and did some, just extraordinary jobs. Again, working in tunnels, working in ground investigation and characterization. I studied civil engineering with geology, which is a slightly odd thing. It's civil engineering infrastructure as you would expect engineering to be taught, but with this wonderful little thing of geology thrown in there, which normally engineering, very analytical, very much about the answers, very much about things having definite answers. And then you throw in the natural world and all this ambiguity that comes with it. And you start to realize just how much we deal with it through engineering, that has natural variability to it. We'll come back to that because it's a really interesting subject as to how you deal with ambiguity generally. But that got me into ground engineering. So I joined BAM as a ground engineer. And every 3 or 4 years I was doing something different in BAM. So fabulously interesting, nice big business with huge opportunity.
You have a particular fascination with tunnels and being underground. And I believe you were involved in quite a big underground project in London at one stage.
I was, yeah. Look, I've spent a lot of my time underground. It is a thing that either thrills you or horrifies you. And so Crossrail is the project you're talking about. As a business, we did a lot of the tunnelling on Crossrail. My particular part of the business was looking after how you deal with the settlement in the ground that happens when you make these tunnels. So if you can imagine when you bore a tunnel, which is what we were doing in London, the ground around it relaxes. And as the ground relaxes, the structures on the surface start to settle down. Now, we were tunnelling under Mayfair in London, the highest value property in London, banks, jewellers, amazing places. It's a natural fact of making those big horizontal holes in the ground that the ground relaxes. So the predictions were that we would have settlement of maybe up to 200 or 300 millimeters in some places. And of course you can't have that with a building. So we have this technique called compensation grouting where we inject liquid cement above the tunnel to jack the ground back up again. So you don't get 200 millimeters of settlement all at once. You get 10 millimeters and then we push it back up by 10 millimeters. Then you get another 10 and we push it back up by 10. So the building stays in the same place, the tunnel stays in the same place, and we sort of fill in the gap with compensation grading. It was wonderful.
That sounds logical, but explain to me the scale that you're doing that on.
So we would sink a shaft, and I would love to take people on tours around Mayfair because I can say we had a shaft there, we had a shaft there. But we would have a vertical shaft, and then we would drill out horizontally up to 90 meters. So we'd be drilling, and the head of the drill would be 2 or 3 streets away, with hundreds of thousands of people every day walking above these things, traffic going, businesses operating, absolutely unaware that that's what was in place. And we had these arrays, these beautiful arrays of grout pipes in the ground that allowed us to access every point where we needed to put grout, and we could just inject. Every time the monitoring system said we're seeing some settlement here, we could go to that particular location and just push it back up again.
Are there any other particular projects that kind of bring back good memories like that for you?
Oh, sure. I did one in called Lochie Tunnels, which is in the Northern Highlands of Scotland, which was hydroelectric tunnels. So these are aqueduct tunnels that allow water to be collected in one part of the hillside and taken through this tunnel and put into a reservoir, and then they're used to generate hydropower. These tunnels, typically between about 2.5 to 4 meters diameter, 2 sets of tunnels here totaling 24 kilometers long. So, going through mountains in Scotland. Now, it's from a technical standpoint, it's wonderful. It's interesting. It's all those things. They were bored in the 50s, and we were in there repairing them, stabilising them, doing rock bolting, hard rock tunnels. So they're unlined, and you go through the middle of this mountain, and you see the rock all around you, and it's beautiful. I mean, you see this fresh-looking rock, but there's something that's even better. I mean, if you take in an ultraviolet light, and this is the geologist in me, you take in an ultraviolet light, and you switch off every other light, and you switch on the UV light, it causes some of the minerals in the rock to fluoresce. And it's like, I don't know, it's like being in a movie. Things just shine and sparkle. It's like diamond mines that you might see in a Disney film. And it is just the most stunningly beautiful natural phenomenon. So yeah, look, there are so many things. In that kind of length of career, one of the real pleasures of working in infrastructure and engineering, particularly as a contractor, is you go to some incredibly interesting places, and you see things, and you go to places that nobody else is allowed to see or sees. So, wonderful.
So listen, tell me about your career then, because you've kind of pivoted through all of those like hands-on engineering projects, and then you kind of got into business roles, and then onto people and culture. Just tell me briefly the story of your journey.
So I went to university fairly young. That's just the Scottish education system. I studied at Glasgow. So I say I've got 3 brothers. At that time, you went to your local university because, well, you couldn't really afford to do anything else. That's where you went to, yeah. Turned out to be a very good university. I really enjoyed my time there. Came out, and as I say, I'd done 2 years of working as a student, as a contractor. And I think as a young engineer, I'd done what was a very theoretical degree. So the view was, I'll do maybe 5 years in contracting, and then I'll move off into consultancy, and I'll be a consultant engineer for the rest of my life. That didn't happen. I went straight into contracting, into a part of the business which was focused on ground engineering, a sort of specialist contracting business on ground engineering. And it was a really interesting way to start your career. So one of the things about specialist businesses is that they are very close to their customers, and they're very close to the doing of things. What a lot of people don't understand around the contracting industry at Tier 1 is there's a lot of subcontracting, there's a lot of management of subcontractors. For us as a business, a lot of direct delivery as well. But a lot of the activity in construction happens within that specialist supply chain. So people are employed there, and they do the special things that, once you add it all together, makes construction. So as a young engineer, the first thing I did was went out onto projects and started to run them. And you were given a project. It had to be planned, it had to be priced, it had to be won. And then when you landed on the project, you had to deliver it, which meant organising your own resources, understanding what they cost, making sure that you were applying for the money that you were earning, working with the customer to understand, is the customer satisfied? Are they getting the thing they need? Managing your workforce, and then reporting all that back, forecasting where you're going to end up, all the other bits and pieces that come from the business, the commerce of contracting. And of course, as a young engineer, you don't really, you're a sponge. You don't think twice about anything like that. You're just doing the things that people are saying, now do this, this is the process, get on with it. Again, as a young engineer, you're looking to do the most exciting and exotic things you can, because it's technically interesting, it's engaging, and it's very self-centered, and it's very much experience built and all those sorts of things. You learn that working with customers. You learn the I would say management of a workforce rather than leading a workforce, because at that stage it's still very much management. And you learn commercial management, which are, from any business perspective, are brilliant things to learn. So that was a real plus in being in that specialist business. After a few years of doing that, you start to, a few things start to dawn on you. That idea that people are looking to you for their cues, that you've got this workforce that are really talented, really capable, don't come from the same background that you do, haven't gone to university, aren't like the circle of friends that you're used to, and you, because of the work you do with them and working really closely with the group of people that you need in order to deliver a project, you really see how they contribute value and how they make their own contributions, which is an interesting realization for a young man from a privileged middle-class background, which is exactly what I was. So you start to think about leadership, not consciously, but it sort of happens. The idea that you've got to motivate people, that you've got to explain to them why they're doing the things they're doing, what it is that is important, and why we're trying to achieve the thing we're trying to achieve, not just dish out instructions and expect people to deal with them. And you also come across some other stuff. I mean, you get tested in a way that's quite surprising. As I say, the surprise of shifting from managing to leading and realizing A, that's a thing, and B, it's a really, really important thing. But also the surprise of having to cope with the unexpected. It's a regrettable fact of construction still, much, much better as it is now. It is still an industry where there is significant hazard, and managing safety is a real problem. And the first time you have an accident or you're exposed to an accident and a real human being, somebody you're responsible for, is injured, that's a real moment of change for you as an individual.
When you talk about that, do you have a particular incident in mind that you can share?
I have to say I've got a lot in my history, unfortunately, where very minor incidents, and you can look at them and you can understand how you prevent them in retrospect, and a very small number of more significant incidents. And they all leave an impact on you. And they all leave an impact on you because you learn a very interesting thing. The time you spend thinking most about safety is normally immediately after an accident. You look at it, you understand it, you think, if only, here's the things we could have done that would have prevented this. And a lot of what we do now actually within the business is about trying to find better ways to do that, to get people to think about safety without them having to go through the consequences of having an accident. And a curious thing, and this is a really interesting thing about the business right now, as you get safer and the accidents become further and further apart in time, the opportunities for learning get further and further apart in time. So you need to find a new way of learning. You need to find a new way that triggers that. How do we make this better? And we do that through a particular way in the business now, which is really, really successful. But in those days, so that was the 90s. The first time you injure somebody or somebody's injured on your project, or you have an incident, something happens, it is unplanned, it's surprising, and you are the person. You have to cope.
How does that make you feel?
It's a huge mix of emotions. Again, I think engineers are trained to be very analytical and very pragmatic and get things going, even more so in contracting. So when something happens, it's full activity mode. Stop this, change that, make it safe, do this. All the activity comes out around how you deal with the immediate aftermath of something, whether it's safety, whether it's technical, whatever it is, to stabilize the situation. And then that period of reflection happens, and it happens at the same time as investigation and improvement and all those things. But the personal reflections that come from that, particularly around safety, build up. I won't say that on day one, when the first day after an accident has happened and something you're responsible for, you're immediately changed. You are, but not in ways you recognise. But over a period of a few years of not very many of these things happening, but enough that has that impact, you start to understand the nature of that responsibility and how that compares with some of the other responsibilities you have. There's a really interesting thing. So I became a dad when I was 28 or 29, something like that. And prior to that, work was absolutely everything. The biggest problem I could think of was a work problem, all those sorts of things. And I now say to my staff, until you've stood in a paediatric A&E at 2:00 in the morning with your child in the arms, you don't really know what a problem looks like. And after you've done that, then it gives you a different perspective. And it allows, when something happens, say an accident happens, my first question is anybody hurt? And if the answer to that is no, the rest we can deal with.
It's really interesting how you say there's a difference between managing a project as an engineer and then leading people. And it's something you seem to have come through kind of quite naturally, because as you are managing, then you become a leader, something you didn't realize. You can learn by experience, which is one way of doing things, but obviously it's better to learn from others' experience before you and to do some kind of professional or personal development on that. Were you able to learn about leading people as a result of those incidents and experiences that you had.
Yeah, and through both of the mechanisms that you've just mentioned there. So, as an organisation, we've always done lots of very good individual development. Early career stage used to be very focused on technical development, and leadership didn't come until later on. We've changed that a lot in the business now, that leadership, as soon as people are being exposed to the idea that they are managing groups of people, we help them into leadership training because it's such a positive impact and it makes such a difference commercially in our business. It makes a huge difference because you end up with better managers and better leaders. But for those individuals, it accelerates the way they think about those things. But informally, and I think certainly in my early career, that was the most profound thing. I had some really inspirational people that I worked with who, without formally teaching about leading, or without even perhaps knowing that they were doing it, through leading by example, visible leadership, and just the way they conducted themselves and the humanity of them actually allowed you to recognise that this is a good way of doing things. I had a particular line manager, a chap called Ian Dalglish. He's retired now, but Ian and I still keep in regular contact. And I think Ian, I would say, allowed me to understand that you can run a big business, a complex business like a contractor, that has lots of commercial concerns, that has lots of activity going on all at once. You can do all of that without being a monster, without being a table banger. You can do that and still be a human being. And that, if I can pass on any lesson, that's the one I want to pass on to people. Humanity, and being authentic and true to yourself and true to human beings that you're working with is much, much more powerful than the whole command and control, trying to tell people what to do. Most often, when you try and tell people what to do, number one, they're a bit suspicious of it, and number two, at least some of them don't do it. So it's really not a great method of how you get things done.
I think the points you're making about people and the importance of people is stuff that you don't really realise until you're, as you say, in the middle of a job. And there's all kinds of, which you're very experienced at now with diversity and inclusion and all kinds of things which I want to talk about later. But firstly, I want to just pivot and talk about BAM for a few minutes, because BAM Ireland is known for delivering ambitious projects across all kinds of sectors. And one of the biggest and most well-known recently is the National Children's Hospital. Big projects like that always have changes. Can you tell me firstly, how big is the National Children's Hospital project and why is there always changes when it comes to these things?
So it's one of the largest buildings in Europe, and I think perhaps some of the commentators on the project or on the outcomes of the project don't necessarily understand just what a scale of project it is. 6,500 rooms. It is going to be the envy of not just European but Western hospital paediatric care across the world, really. It's an extraordinary facility. It's a brilliant facility for Ireland, the whole island of Ireland, and it will transform paediatric care without a shadow of a doubt. But of course, it's not at that stage yet. It's at the stage where people see it as a project, they see it as government expenditure, and of course, they're quite rightly concerned about those things. I think as you zoom out from that, and I've been involved with lots of major projects, you start to see patterns in some of them. And one of these patterns that you see around major projects, and let's not apply this absolutely to Children's Hospital. It has its own particular features, but generally speaking, with major projects, one of the things you notice is that, and I'll be clear, major public funded infrastructure projects, they're huge, so they tend to only be affordable by governments, and immediately then you have the value for money, public expenditure questions being asked, which takes you into the political arena, and quite rationally, society are interested in that. These projects are hugely complex. They are so complex that in reality, being able to understand the scope and delivery at the start, before you've done anything, becomes almost impossible from a sort of philosophical standpoint. They are so complex that the complexity can't be seen until you're in amongst it. But of course, we have ways of dealing with that. And one of the ways of dealing with that is detailed, rigorous engineering planning. The more time you can spend on that before you start building, the better the outcomes are. And that's a lesson from major infrastructure construction everywhere. Unfortunately, that tends to conflict with a political desire that once you've got permission, planning, authority, budget for doing something, you really want, start now. Shovels in the ground, build, because the political capital that comes from having started something, the visibility of starting something, and the public's need to see that progress is being made is a physical need rather than a sort of practical need. And so often these projects can be started before they are actually ready to start, and the result of that is that change happens as you go through the project. Again, I'm not going to say that's specifically what's happened at Children's Hospital, but it's a thing that you see. The other really interesting recurring theme that happens with these major infrastructure projects that are hugely impactful on, creation of opportunity in society, creation of wealth, provision of service, whatever it looks like that the benefit is. Once that benefit starts being provided, the day you start treating a child in the Children's Hospital, everything that's gone before is forgotten. I mean, if I talk about Dublin specifically, Port Tunnel, do you remember Port Tunnel? You look at infrastructure like that, deeply problematic and complex in its time.
It was at
an
the
absolutely
time,
essential piece of infrastructure now. Dublin Airport Terminal 2. It's you wouldn't imagine Dublin Airport without Terminal 2 right now. But another complex infrastructure project that had its own challenges.
I want to get back to this particular topic of public procurement, because public procurement and contracting models is something you will be very familiar with, right? Can I ask you, what is your view on identifying the best procurement model for Ireland, which is focusing not just on the cost, but on delivering the right outcomes for the country?
Well, you've nailed it just in that sentence. Outcome focus is the thing that's here. Now, Ireland's had all sorts of challenges, as every country has, in how you procure infrastructure effectively. And there's a lot of moving parts in that. You've got, how well funded is the country? How are you procuring that money? Is it money that's in the Treasury? Is it money that's coming from external financing? What's the risk appetite for the organisations that are delivering this? Because, fundamentally, risk starts with the person who wants to develop it. If you want to build a tunnel somewhere, let's say you want to build a tunnel for a metro system in Dublin, for example. Right now, that's a government problem, and all the risk sits with the government. At some point, they'll contract to some organisation to do some construction, and the purpose of that contract is to pass risk. It's to deliver scope, but it's fundamentally a risk sharing model, if you like. You ask somebody to do something, they commit to do it, and they take certain risks in doing that for a commercial price. That's changed a lot in the past 5 years, actually, never mind the past 10 or 20 years, that the level of risk associated with the business model of contracting has changed enormously. And the ability of contractors' balance sheets to sustain that, or I'll put that a different way, the willingness of contractors to sustain those kind of risks on their balance sheets has reduced enormously. The construction industry knows very well what it's doing. It absolutely can deliver these projects well. And actually, Ireland is good at delivering these projects. There's a narrative that says we don't know how to do this in Ireland. Not true. We do know how to do it. We just sometimes choose to do it in a way that is different, and you end up with the wrong outcome. But jumping back to what you want from this, anybody who's procuring, fundamentally, they're looking for something around budget, something around programme, and something around the expected benefits. So let's call those outcomes. If a procurement model that you're currently using doesn't take you to those outcomes, then it can't be right. So single stage lump sum contracting, or offering up complex projects to say, before, we conceptualise something for 6 years, then put it out to the market for 3 months to have it priced, which is automatically a rush and therefore, information poor and time poor. Tell me right now, without knowing anything about the future, what that's going to cost, and you can't charge me any more, by the way. How do you expect that model to deliver a rational outcome? And that takes you to a thing we call two-stage contracting. Now, two-stage contracting has unfortunately got a bit of a poor reputation in Ireland from a couple of implementations. It is right now the best way, and it's demonstrably the best way. And it does two things. You have a first stage, which has to be competed for, so you have the market competition thing, but the first stage allows the customer and the contractor and other interested parties to work together, paid to work together, to develop the scope, the planning, the risk profile, and get to the end of the first stage where the customer knows what it is that they're going to be paying for this, that everybody has talked about what it is we're doing, that the design is fully developed, the risks are understood and properly allocated, and crucially the scope alignment, so the understanding of what the customer thinks they're getting versus what the contractor thinks they're providing, is perfect, because you've been working collaboratively together to do it. If at that point the customer says, this is the right answer, let's go, you move into phase 2, and that's building. The customer can also say, actually, having gone through all this detailed phase, I can see I don't want to do this, or this isn't the right price, we need to do something else. Most commonly, challenges that happen with construction, or the reason that construction goes wrong, is that the expectation of the customer and the belief from the contractor of what they're providing start misaligned. So that's scope misalignment. And if you start with a misaligned scope, it never gets better. It just gets worse and worse and worse. So it's a real challenge. One of the challenges that people throw at two-stage contracting is, well, you do this first stage, and that just increases the cost of these jobs. It's much more expensive because everything's getting lumped in there and da 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 da. What actually happens is it gives you a much closer view of what the likely outturn cost is. If you want to compare procurement methods that say, give me your best guess of what you think is going to cost, so your best tender price at the start, yes, you can compare those. You can compare those all day long, and you can go for lowest price, or you can go for some other most economically advantageous model. But that's just the price that's proposed at the start. It doesn't include anything that might happen or anything you could foresee happening if you had a bit more time to spend on it. And it's certainly not a brilliant guide to what the outturn cost is going to be.
No. So procurement is a complicated area, and as you say, it's about budget and then it's about benefits. Another thing that I think you must be considering is sustainability, because it's a huge focus for engineering today, and there's a lot of kind of rethinking and change going on in the construction industry around that. BAM says that it's committed to building a sustainable tomorrow. Sounds great. Lovely little...
Sounds very corporate, doesn't it?
Yeah, very corporate. Explain to me as a human being exactly what that looks like and how it's being implemented.
So you'll have heard of net zero, yeah? Everybody talks about net zero. So this is about getting to a place where the carbon emissions of the way we live our lives there's no net emissions of carbon. There might be some emissions of carbon, but there's something else that offsets them. If you understand that 39-40% of carbon emissions come from the construction or operation of the built environment, whether that's infrastructure, buildings, the house you live in, the way you heat your house, the way you travel, 39 to 40% of anthropogenic CO2 emissions come from that. If you can't deal with the built environment, which is the construction industry, then you just can't get to net anything. So you have to deal with the way that construction traditionally gets done and the way we operate the built environment, the buildings we have and the infrastructure we use. So very straightforwardly, there's two parts to that. There is the capital build phase. That's the bit that I suppose I'm very involved in as a contracting business. What does it cost? What do we emit in doing these things? And then there's the operational phase. What does it cost to run your building? Power, water, heating particularly. The operational phase is very strongly guided by how the facilities are designed. How are they designed to operate? So things like putting an air source heat pump into your house or into your building instead of a gas boiler or an oil-fired boiler. Zoom out to building scale, the kind of buildings you see in Central Cork, Central Dublin, Central Galway, big, impressive buildings. And of course, they're heated in different ways. Efficiency is important, how they're insulated. Things like lighting, making sure that the lighting is efficient and well designed. Energy consumption, water consumption, trying to limit the use of water. There's some other interesting aspects in sustainability as well that aren't just about consumption, but the way that the building deals with the environment. So we take a green field and we turn it into something hard and concrete or aluminium or whatever. When rain hits that, it runs straight off it and into the drainage system instead of soaking gently into a field. When rain hits a field, the water flow is attenuated, it's slowed down. When rain hits a building, it's speeded up and it rushes down into the sewers and you get these flood surges that happen. So now when we design buildings, just as a case in point, we've done one in southern Dublin, we have what's called a blue roof. So it has a green roof, you're probably familiar with that, a roof that looks sort of grassy. It's actually a different kind of plant, it's not grass, but it looks nice, it's not like a hard roof. So water comes into that, but beneath that, we also have a water storage layer, so it attenuates the rainfall. It doesn't just hit the building and go straight into downpipes, it hits the building and is slowed down so that the peak flows in the outfall into the sewer are much, much slower. Come back to the construction phase, just to be absolutely sort of final point in this, the construction phase, one of the biggest things you see in civil engineering construction is diesel being burned to construct these things. Big equipment, fueled by diesel, plumes of smoke, CO2 emissions. 2 years ago, I switched our business to using hydrotreated vegetable oil, certified hydrotreated vegetable oil. That's a really important distinction. So this is not HVO that comes from palm oil or first virgin sources, if you like. It comes from used waste oils that are recycled to make a fuel. That has a huge impact on our CO2 emissions that come from liquid fuels. The thing that everybody's doing, our car fleet, so we have a fairly big car fleet, 300 or 400 cars, moving those over to EV over a period of 3 years. By the end of 2026, our fleet will be 100% EV. So, we really are stopping doing the things that we said we would stop doing.
Also on planning projects, while we're talking about these things, how is BAM handling the challenge of supporting biodiversity that may be interrupted by sites?
Biodiversity is one of the most interesting, most productive challenges for us, actually. It's really hard to measure. So we don't yet have a great measure of what improvement in biodiversity is in a purely numerical sense. But conceptually and qualitatively, you can absolutely see it. So imagine what if you imagine a motorway, what a motorway looks like, and how the engineering profession says this is how a motorway should look. It's strips of tarmac. And at the side, sometimes you're in a cutting where you've got slopes going up from you, and sometimes you're on an embankment where you've got slopes going down from you. So you have this alignment of the road, and it doesn't just follow the land, it cuts through the land, sometimes cutting, sometimes embankment. And you'll picture those embankments and those cuttings, and you'll see long, planar surfaces that are covered in grass, the same kind of grass, and it's very neat, it's very geometric. It's exactly how an engineer would draw this. This is what good practice looks like. Make it neat, make it tidy, it's easy to maintain, easy to construct. And so from an engineering standpoint, that's been best practice for many, many years. And from a biodiversity standpoint, it's catastrophic. It's monocultural grasses. The roads and indeed rails, long linear infrastructure is a real problem because it interrupts the movement of animals. So animals that are naturally migratory are animals that are territorial, so as they produce offspring, have to expand their space. These long bits of linear infrastructure block that. So what do you do about it? Well, there's a few things. You can start using things like green tunnels. It's just one solution, but it's a solution where you allow these spaces, green tunnels and green bridges, these crossing points at regular intervals on long linear infrastructure to allow natural migration of animals. But you look at those long linear slopes, those planar slopes with monocultural grasses on them, what we actually need there is some decay and decomposition. Positive decay and decomposition. Now, saying those words and the word positive in the same sentence sounds nuts, but that is how nature works, that you need that. You don't want to be cutting the grass all the time. You want trees that fall over and rot, and they support insect life, and they create nutrients and all those sorts of things. So the way that we manage those landscapes changed. Don't make the mistake of thinking they're not managed. It's very popular to talk about rewilding as a solution. Rewilding is just another way of managing a landscape. These are now managed landscapes, and we have to deal with them. If you look at the global biodiversity loss, and you look at a map of that, the Ireland and the UK are in the bottom 10%. The most biodiversity, the most sort of loss of natural biodiversity across the globe, largely through land use. This is about how we've set up our infrastructure, but also how we use the land that we've turned over to farming. This is not farming is bad. This is just we have to find ways to manage the landscape in a different way that support all the things we need as a society, infrastructure and farming amongst them, but also all the things we need in order to continue. What are we doing as a business? Well, we're starting to feed this into the way we design these projects, the way we conceptualize them, the way we advise customers about them, and the kinds of things we leave behind. Fewer monocultural landscapes, more active biodiversity, where we manage motorways, and we do plenty of that in Ireland, thinking about the way that we manage verge cutting and things like that. Less of it, allow wildlife to grow, allow plant life to grow, variations in plant life, even sometimes things that are a little bit twee, but bug hotels and beehives and things like that all make an important impact. But the biggest single thing we can do is change what we think the best practice in constructing long linear infrastructure looks like.
Let me get away from the environment and back to people. And one thing I hear over and over again on the podcast is about engineering and diversity and inclusion within the industry. From your point of view, why is it important?
Well, we are of society and in society as an organisation. If you honestly believe that we can construct the right things for society in the right way and not include the viewpoints and contributions from part of society, whatever that part looks like, whether it's gender, race, whatever it is, then you're kidding yourself. When you look at the way that infrastructure is designed, and let me give you an example around public transport. If you are, like you and I are, a white male of a certain age, confident in our space, the world has been designed around us. So the world has been designed to suit us because it's been designed by people like us and built by people like us to be operated. So when you walk into a railway station in Dublin, or you're sitting in Kent Station in Cork, or Kent Station down in Galway, which we are rebuilding, by the way, you're standing there, it's an environment that you're completely comfortable with. If you're standing there at 10 o'clock on a Friday night and it's not terribly well lit and there's not very many people around and you're a woman, you've probably got a different experience of that. You've certainly got a different experience of that. And how can we deal with that? Well, that is an environment that's been created by engineering design. you can absolutely make those environments safer, warmer, more welcoming by changing the way you design that infrastructure. And unless you've got that insight at design stage and at construction stage, then you're not going to build the right thing that works for the rest of society.
So this is why you're saying we need a more diverse people included in the industry at the design side in engineering, because they will bring these different perspectives and the projects will be better as a result.
Exactly that. Let me give you another example. You're wandering around city centre Cork, somebody's doing some work on something, they've put a hoarding up, it's blocked off a bit of the pavement, so you have to step off the pavement into a temporary walkway, da-da-da-da-da. Now you and I can manage that. You know, we're able-bodied, we can walk and all the rest of it. If you're a wheelchair user, if you've got a buggy, if you are not of that group, then just that simple change has a really profound impact on the quality of your life that day, or actually your ability to do something. Those insights are necessary for how we think about infrastructure, even in a temporary sense. And then, of course, from a business perspective, this is dead obvious. You know, even if you don't believe the moral case for including people in your business, we are sitting here in Ireland with basically full employment bar structural factors. So we have not just a skills crisis, but a total availability of population crisis. Is the civil engineering and construction industry sufficiently attractive that people are rushing towards it? No, not really. So we need to make sure that we have access to all of the people, the potential talent that could come into our business, and make sure that they feel that this is a welcoming environment for them to come to and stay.
Do you think there are kind of preconceptions then about how engineering works that's creating barriers?
Oh yeah, absolutely. When we do student placements or school placements, one of the things we try and do is get the parents in on day one, because more often than not, the parents are hugely influential in how children choose careers or feel about a certain industry. And often the parents have a view of construction. If they're not exposed to construction or infrastructure, or indeed engineering more broadly, directly, they tend to have a view on it that is, you know, sometimes a bit dirty. It's about manufacturing, or it's about digging holes and stuff, and it looks a bit, I don't really want my daughter to go there. And then you bring them along and you show them the really high quality of professionals that we have within our business. The amount of money we spend on incredibly productive modern equipment, the use of digitalization. I mean, it's Minecraft writ big, if you like. And the parents see this, and they see the care and attention, sophistication, understanding, and the supportive culture around what we do. And I have to say that parents absolutely love our industry when they see it, and they're very happy to say, you know, my daughter, my son, yeah, go and do your placement there. But before that contact, yes, there's absolutely preconceived notions around mucky, dirty, you know, not very nice industry.
Listen, let me wrap up our chat today by talking about something we love talking about on the podcast, the future. From your point of view, though, looking towards the future, how do you see engineering evolving in the next 10 years?
Well, look, we're sitting here today. There is a Force 11 storm across Ireland. We've just come through a Christmas period where one of the principal freight transport links came out of action. You start to understand that Ireland is in a place where its infrastructure is fragile, and the infrastructure that supports the rest of society needs attention, needs to be built. And on top of that, when you look at the challenges that Ireland as a country faces and the world generally faces, these extreme weather events that are challenging the infrastructure that we have now, buildings, you know, where the cooling systems aren't enough to keep them cool in the peaks of summer heat, railways where we have the rails that buckle in the peaks of summer heat, cold weather snaps that freeze and land snow on us that we can't clear for a week. Those kinds of events are coming now, and they're coming more regularly, and our infrastructure is not shaped for it. So we need to update the infrastructure we've got, and we need to build new infrastructure that helps society work. And the positive around this is, you can see this also from the way that government policy is shaped around this, people really now understand the value of that infrastructure and how it creates opportunity and employment for a future Ireland. So I would say, if you're thinking about coming into engineering generally, construction specifically, it is probably the most important 50 years coming in construction that there has ever been. When you look at the challenges that the world has to deal with, we are the organisations, we are the industry, almost uniquely, that has the capability to deal with that.
it's happening and it's changing so fast that the next 10 years is going to be particularly important. Aside from that, on the technology side of things, we've got AI, everybody's talking about it. You've got more and more use of robots and stuff like that. Are you excited by any of those new technologies?
Oh, hugely. And they're making a big impact in our industry already. Efficiency, effectiveness. We've gone through quite a long period of productivity not really enhancing, and then you start to see how some of these automation techniques are really enhancing our productivity. And whether that is modularization for house building, or whether that is about much cleverer, more expensive capital equipment that we buy, but it's much more productive and therefore it's worth it. Those things are changing. What you will definitely see in construction over the coming years is there will be fewer people in construction, which is, it's a bit like the genesis that farming went through. It becomes more productive, and it's not because it doesn't mean that fewer people are employed in the industry. What happens is there is a bigger industry because it's able to do more. So by increasing our productivity, we get away from some of the skill challenges that mean that we just need more people to do things. And with the people we've got, but we do need people, let's be clear, but with the people we've got, we can do even more. It's a huge opportunity. And digitalization, it's just extraordinary what we do now compared with even 5 years ago. Absolutely amazing.
And my favourite expression is when you look at these new technologies, you have to remember that this is the worst they will ever be. What about finally on materials? Because materials are changing all the time. Lots of innovation there. Have you seen any that excite you?
Yeah, and we're actually doing a lot in that space. So concrete and steel, our industry is addicted to concrete and steel, both very, very high embedded carbon content materials. And of course, if we want to get to net zero, we're going to have to do something around that. So one of the technologies we've been working on, biocarbonization, it is about how you treat the ground in situ using bacteria. I'm not going to bore you about it now, but it's an extraordinary use of natural resource that you can use bacteria to improve the strength of the ground. So instead of doing that traditional construction thing of digging a hole, dumping the soil, and then filling the hole full of concrete, you can actually treat the soil so it's got a higher strength and is more usable as a construction material. But we must start using more effectively ceramics, fibre-based materials, get away from our absolute addiction to concrete and steel. Aviation's been doing this for many, many years. The materials are well understood. They absolutely have application in civil engineering.
Last question for you, Alasdair, and a little bit of advice for everybody who's listening today. You've got a very interesting point of view on what engineers should be interested in. Explain to me.
So when I talk to people about the things that they should be developing in their career, and of course you do get lots of people who come and say, how do I get your job? How do I become like you? Not many actually, but people who want to progress in their careers. And the thing I say to them, I suppose is a little bit surprising, but the thing I value most is breadth. And that's for a few reasons. Breadth of understanding of the world that you're working in. As I say, we are in society and of society. If you don't understand it, then the decisions you make around how you do things will not be good decisions.
Sorry, you're talking breadth.
Bread, yeah. So,
all right, yeah.
Maybe
the Scottish accent makes it sounds like bread. You say toast. So anyway, the breadth of understanding. Go on.
Yeah, and that's that's everything. That is, it's culture, it's society. Why do we do the things we do? Why we talk? Why do we exist? Philosophy. Philosophy. You should absolutely be interested in philosophy, understanding what it is, where we've come from, where we're going. Those things might not sound like engineering, but they change your perspectives and your outlook and help you engage with stakeholders who are relying on you to do good work and help them meet their requirements. All of that feeds into a sort of critical thinking mode. One of the challenges that we have in the modern world is lack of critical thinking, and it often comes from an inability to see perspectives from other people. If you work to improve your breadth, apart from it being interesting and self-fulfilling anyway, it also allows you to be a better critical thinker because you are able to see and understand more perspectives. Helps you reduce your availability heuristic biases. It helps you reduce your confirmation biases. All those things that constrain critical thinking. And goodness knows we could do with so much more critical thinking in the modern world.
What a fantastic point of view to wrap up on. If you'd like to find out more about Alasdair and some of the topics that we spoke about today, you'll find notes and link details in the description area of the podcast. But for now, Alasdair Henderson, Executive Director of BAM Ireland, thank you so much for joining us.
Thanks, Dusty. It's been a pleasure.
If you enjoyed our podcast today, do share with a friend in the business. Just tell them to search for Engineers Ireland in their podcast player. The podcast is produced by dustpod.io for Engineers Ireland. For advanced episodes and more information on career development opportunities, there are libraries of information on our website at engineersireland.ie. Until next time, from myself, Dusty Rhodes, thank you for listening.